Their member, Rachel, was the first to break the silence, her eyes darting around the dimly lit room in a desperate attempt to distract herself from the figure's piercing stare. She took a hesitant step back, her hand instinctively reaching for the knife at her belt. The weight of the blade was a comforting presence, a reminder of the situation they'd been in before. "I don't," Rachel said, her voice barely above a whisper. The figure's eyes never wavered, its gaze fixing on hers as if daring her to lie. "I don't know what you're talking about," Rachel continued, but her tone betrayed her uncertainty. Rachel glanced at the others, searching for support, but their faces were as blank as the figures. Tom stood hunched, his arms crossed, and an uncomfortable silence floundering between them. Lena, usually the most level-headed, was fidgeting with her hands, as if unable to calm the turmoil within her. That's when Rachel remembered her mother using the word remember, the connotations of that single phrase like a rusty key unlocking a buried memory. Her grip on the knife tightened as a frayed edge of memory began to reassemble itself. "Please," she mentioned quietly. The figure spoke again, its raspy voice a stark contrast to the group's murmuring. "Try harder," it said once more before pausing. Silence spread throughout the room like an amoeba consuming oxygen. It was the silence that broke them, Tom. "You're—" he murmured, the sentence awkward as a ballroom dancer attempting a tango. The group watched as Tom composed himself, drawing upon some mental reserve that required an immeasurable amount of courage and strength. However, a burst of raw emotion unleashed after the words had left his lips. "Us," he insisted louder, forcing a sense of protest out. "What about us?" Rachel's grip on the knife tightened once more. A single phrase echoed within her mind. "You can only go back so far," and another phrase followed. "Don't trust him." The words cut at her for the stranger who now held a large tablet, eyes hovering above a screen filled with a tangled series of dates and lines. The figure shifted its weight ever so slightly, the movement almost imperceptible. But it was enough to break the lingering tension in the room. Lena finally relaxed her nervous hand movements, her gaze flicking between the tablet and the figure. Tom's shoulders squared, a faint determination burning in his eyes. Rachel took a cautious step forward, her hand still gripping the knife handle. "That's just a bunch of random dates," she said, trying to sound more confident than her voice betrayed. The figure raised an eyebrow, a faint smile playing on its lips. It was a movement so slight that Rachel wasn't even sure if she saw it. The figure leaned forward, its eyes still locked on Rachel's. A pen hovered in its hand, poised over the tablet. "That's what it means?" Rachel asked, her tone incredulous. The figure nodded once, twice. Its gaze refocused on a different person in the room, and Tom finally ventured to speak. His voice was shaky, laced with uncertainty. "What's going on? What does this have to do with us?" The figure turned back to Rachel. "Your parents, you included, were part of an experiment long ago." The words dropped like a bombshell, stirring up memories that had been buried for so long. Rachel's grip on the knife tightened as a mixture of fear and anger coursed through her veins. "What kind of experiment?" she demanded. The figure leaned in closer, its eyes burning with an unnerving intensity. "Project Harmony," it said, the words dripping with malevolence. "You five were selected for your unique genetic makeup. You were meant to enhance humanity's potential, but they got scared. Suddenly you were nothing but pawns in a much larger game." Rachel felt like she was being punched in the gut. She stumbled backward, the room spinning around her. Tom caught her by the elbow, steadying her. Lena and Tom exchanged a nervous glance. The figure raised its eyebrow again. "Harmony Protocol initiated contingency protocols," it said, the words flat and emotionless. "Protocol designed to limit outgrowth and standardize results." A cold dread seeped into Rachel's bones as she turned to the tablet. Dates began to rearrange themselves, new lines and marks sprouting from the existing ones. It was as if the truth was trying to explain itself. "We're just numbers in some program," Lena whispered, her voice incredulous. Tom's jaw clenched, a determined glint in his eyes. "We're more than that," he said, his voice firm. "We're people with our own stories, our own memories." The figure shifted its weight once more. This time it took a step back, causing the floor creak beneath its movement. "Your stories are subjective," it said, its tone cold and logical. "Project Harmony aimed to impose order on your world, but there is more to the true nature of your existence." As the figure's words hung in the air, it flipped the tablet over, revealing a sketch of the group. The figure used its pen, drawing a few lines on the surface. "We can go back," it said, its voice barely above a whisper. "We can change the course of events, but first you must believe." Rachel felt the world around her slipping away, replaced by an unholy chill running through her veins. What did the figure want from them? Was it possible to change the past, or was it just a way to manipulate them further? Tom's voice rose as his legs began to shake, a burst of adrenaline, a fleeting friend in the fight. What about the accident, the one that brought you back? He asked, trying to keep his footing steady despite the turmoil that churned within him. The words tasted like ashes in his mouth, but he pushed on as if driven by an unrelenting will to express himself. He paused for a moment, trying to regroup and find his footing, but fear threatened to consume him as the figure continued to stare, impervious to the group's growing desperation. Its gaze didn't waver, even as Tom's mind searched for a connection between the figure's words and their shared reality. They stood frozen in time, each step a heart-stopping struggle as they sought answers that had long been hidden. Lena finally broke the silence, her voice a tiny tremor as she interjected, her tone laced with a desperate hope. "What sort of accident?" she asked, her question hesitant. Tom turned to her, a respite from the fixation that seemed to suck their life force away. "They called it an accident, a gas explosion in the research lab," he whispered. "But everyone knows someone didn't survive." The figure's expression remained unwavering, though it leaned in a fraction more, its brow furrowed. Its gaze lingered on them for a moment longer before moving away to scour the room once more, scrutinizing as if searching for something and someone that didn't exist. Lena watched in a mixture of horror and amazement as a piece of their reality slipped into the shadows. Suddenly, shadows came back to haunt, revealing people in their corners, ears listening out in a silent pact they'd never had. The group of friends was always the one the stranger's eyes fixated upon. The room went silent once more, atoned only by heavy breathing and fractured silence. For one brief moment, it seemed as if the room itself was willing them to come clean, the air filled with tension that turned the thin line between power and helplessness into an almost non-existent chasm, staring them in the face like the weight of responsibility. Rachel's gaze snapped up at the stranger, her mind working overtime to process the new information. The tablet seemed out of place in the dimly lit room, and the tangled web of dates and lines on the screen only added to the sense of unease. The stranger's eyes flicked up, the lid closing around them like a soft wave. "Try harder," the figure's raspy voice echoed once more, the demand grating against the fragile tension built up inside them. It took all Tom's willpower to continue, his quiet insistence echoing in Lena's horrified mind. "What about us?" Tom's words hung suspended like a fragile flower about to bloom. The room seemed to expand around them, once more shattering the oppressive atmosphere, allowing memories long locked to break free. As a glimpse of what-ifs flashed through Rachel's mind, her grip on the knife remained taut, trying to cling to reality. Her thoughts had been twisted in a confusing dance, conjuring up anything but the truth. You can only go so far. The thought came gnawing at her, fueled by an inexplicable, eerie dread. Don't trust him. The phrase reappeared, fueled by an uneasy memory that refused to be dislodged. Rachel's past was buried, but images and fragments were now reviving like a siren's melody in the labyrinth of her mind. A desperate memory came together, forging a link to an enigmatic, long-forgotten chapter in their lives. A name echoed up from the smoldering rubble, and a single memory burst out into their collective consciousness, flooding the room with an explosion of recollection. The group stared through the swirling haze, a fleeting glimpse of a carefree existence passing swiftly before their minds. They stood just one day away from an event that had shaped their worlds and tore their lives asunder. The stranger's eyes narrowed, the corners of his mouth twisting into a slight, almost imperceptible smile as he nodded, as if aware of the impact Tom's words had had on the group. His gaze flickered towards the dates and lines on the tablet, and Rachel's grip on the knife tightened further, her anxiety spiking as a cold dread began to seep into her bones. "You see, your memories," the stranger began, his voice dripping with an unsettling calm, "are not entirely reliable. Like a puzzle with missing pieces, they only ever seem to fit in your mind. You can't recall the truth because in your heads the lines blur between reality and—" Tom's next question broke through the darkness. "What do you mean?" "I mean," the figure cut him off, "your memories are fragments, ripped away probably during the incident. You've tried to fill in the gaps, but the truth only ever seems to slip further away." His gaze swept across the group, each face displaying a mix of revulsion and horror. "You can't trust your own memories." Lena spoke up first, her voice trembling. "But what about the pictures, the memories we've found? Are they forgeries?" The figure chuckled, the low, raspy sound echoing through the room like a crackling fire. "Forgeries, perhaps, but the truth, That's something else entirely. Rachel felt like she'd been punched in the gut, the air knocked from her lungs. Forgers, but what about all the photos they'd found? What about the memories that felt so real? "What's the incident?" Tom asked, his voice laced with desperation. "What happened to us?" The figure's eyes locked onto Tom's, a glint of something sinister in their depths. "The incident was a reshuffling, a rearranging of your memories for purposes." Lena took a step back, her eyes wide with fear. "Purpose," she whispered. The figure nodded, the movement almost imperceptible. "Purpose, and you are not who you think you are." The room around them fell silent once more, the weight of the stranger's words crushing their spirits. The group stood frozen, their minds reeling with questions and uncertainty. And then, without warning, the figure vanished, the tablet slipping from his grasp to fall to the floor with a soft clatter. The group breathed collectively, relief washing over them like a wave as they looked at each other, searching for answers in each other's eyes. But the truth was, they had so few, and the stranger's parting words had left them with more questions than ever. The group's eyes darted to the tablet, and a collective shiver ran down their spines. The figure began to scroll through the dates, its gaze fixed on the screen as if searching for something specific. The room held its breath, frozen in anticipation of what was to come. The dates passed in a blur, a seemingly haphazard collection of information that left the group reeling. Rachel's eyes widened as she spotted a name she recognized, her mind racing with memories long thought to be lost. Her mother. "What is this?" Tom asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The figure didn't respond, its gaze still fixed on the screen. Instead, it began to speak in a monotone voice, reciting a string of dates and events that only made sense to the figure. Rachel's grip on the knife tightened as the words cut into her, a sense of dread creeping up her spine. According to the tablet, her mother had been part of a secret experiment, one that had pushed the boundaries of human psychology to unimaginable lengths. The group's memories began to resurface, fragmented and disjointed, but enough to know that they had lived through something traumatic. The figure stopped speaking, its gaze finally shifting away from the screen. The room held its breath as the figure paused, taking a slow, deliberate breath in and out. The air was heavy with anticipation, the group's collective anxiety reaching a boiling point. Then, in a movement so sudden it was almost imperceptible, the figure bowed its head in respect. The group was left staring, unsure of what to make of the gesture. The silence was oppressive, but it was broken by a single word. "Started." The figure's eyes snapped back into focus, its gaze piercing as it directed the word towards the group. In that moment, the world around them seemed to shift, the very fabric of reality unraveling. Rachel's grip on the knife loosened, her hand falling to her side as she felt an unseen force urging her back. Tom stood, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and confusion. "What?" he whispered. Lena took a step forward, her hand reaching out as if to connect with the figure. The group held its collective breath, the air thick with anticipation. And then, in an instant, the room was bathed in a brilliant light, the figure's eyes blazing with an intensity that was almost blinding. The light was so pure, so real, that for a moment, the group wondered if they were seeing the truth. The light faded, leaving the group blinking in the dimly lit room. The figure stood before them, its eyes still blazing with intensity. And in that moment, the group realized something that would change everything.